Welcome to a journey through some of history's most puzzling mysteries. Tonight, we'll explore cases that remain unsolved, stories that have lingered in the minds of investigators and communities for decades. As you listen, let yourself relax. There's no need to remember every detail. Just let the words wash over you like waves on a distant shore. These are stories of questions without answers, of searches that continue even now, and of the patient, persistent work of those who refuse to forget. Let's begin. Case 1. The Oakland County Child Killer. In the mid-1970s, the suburbs of Detroit were much like any other American community. Tree-lined streets, modest homes, children riding bicycles to the corner store. Oakland County, Michigan, was a place where families felt safe, where parents sent their children on small errands without worry, where childhood meant freedom. But between 1976 and 1977, something changed. A shadow fell across these quiet neighborhoods, and 4 families would find themselves at the center of one of Michigan's largest investigations. A case that remains unsolved to this day. The person responsible has never been identified. Over the years, investigators have called them by a nickname, the babysitter, a name that would come to represent both the care and the cruelty at the heart of this mystery. The first disappearance? February is cold in Michigan, the kind of cold that makes you hurry from building to building, that turns your breath to fog in the afternoon air. On February 15, 1976, a 12-year-old boy named Mark Stebbins left an American Legion Hall in Ferndale. He was on his way home. A short journey, the kind that children made every day. But Mark never arrived home that evening. His family waited. They called friends. They searched the neighborhood. They contacted the police. 4 days passed. 4 days of hoping, of imagining he might walk through the door at any moment. On the 4th day, Mark was found in a parking lot in Southfield. He had been harmed, and then left in a place where he would be discovered quickly. He was still wearing the same clothes from the day he vanished. The investigation began, but in those early days, there were few leads. It seemed like a terrible, isolated tragedy. No one yet knew. This was only the beginning. A pattern emerges. 10 months passed. Fall turned to winter. December arrived with its holiday lights and the promise of snow. On December 22, 1976, a 12-year-old girl named Jill Robinson had an argument with her mother. These things happen in families. A disagreement raised voices, hurt feelings. Jill left her home in Royal Oak on her bicycle, perhaps needing some space, perhaps planning to return once she calmed down. Her bicycle was found later, left behind a store. But Jill herself, Jill was gone. 4 days later, on December 26th, her body was discovered along Interstate 75 in Troy. The location was unusual, as within sight of a police station, as if placed deliberately where it would be found. She was fully clothed, her backpack still on her shoulders. The evidence suggested something that deeply troubled investigators. Jill had been kept somewhere for those 4 days. She had been fed, cared for in a way, and then she had been killed and left to be found. Now the police began to wonder. Two children, both 12 years old, both from Oakland County, both held for several days before being found. Was there a connection? The winter of 1977. January in Michigan means snow, deep and persistent. The kind of snow that blankets everything, that muffles sound, that transforms familiar landscapes into something quiet and strange. On January 2nd, 1977, a 10-year-old girl named Christine Mihalik walked to a nearby convenience store in Berkeley. She was going to buy a magazine, a simple errand, the kind that should take 15 minutes. Christine didn't come home. Her family searched. The police searched. Days became weeks. 19 days passed, and with each day, hope became harder to maintain. On the 19th day, a mail carrier discovered something in a snowbank beside a rural road in Franklin Village. It was Christine. She was fully clothed, frozen, positioned carefully. The medical examination revealed something puzzling. Despite being missing for nearly 3 weeks, she had been deceased for less than a day. This meant that for more than 2 weeks, Christine had been somewhere, alive, being held by someone, being cared for, perhaps, fed, kept warm. And then, only at the very end, was her life taken from her. 3 children now, 3 families forever changed, and investigators began to see a pattern they had hoped they wouldn't see. The last known victim. March brought the first hints of spring, warmer days, melting snow, the sense that winter was finally releasing its grip. On March 16, 1977, 11-year-old Timothy King went skating near his home in Birmingham. Afterward, he asked his mother if he could walk to a nearby pharmacy to buy candy. She said yes. Of course she said yes. It was a short walk, and it was still light outside. Timothy left for the pharmacy. Security footage later showed him there making his purchase, a normal moment in what should have been a normal day. But Timothy didn't return home. 6 days later, 2 teenagers found his body in a shallow ditch along a rural road in Livonia. Like the others, Timothy had been held for days. The evidence showed he had been bathed recently. His clothes had been washed. He had eaten fried chicken not long before his death. Someone had cared for him in their way. Someone had fed him, cleaned him, kept him, and then, after nearly a week, had taken his life and left him to be found. The investigation. The task force that formed in response to these cases was substantial. Police from multiple jurisdictions came together. The Michigan State Police became involved. Federal authorities offered assistance. They reviewed thousands of tips. They interviewed countless individuals. They created composite sketches based on witness descriptions. There had been sightings. People who remembered a man talking to Timothy King before he disappeared. A man in his 20s or 30s with shaggy hair and sideburns. Someone who looked trustworthy enough to approach children. The investigation faced challenges. Different jurisdictions meant different procedures, different leadership, different ways of handling evidence. This was the late 1970s, before many of the forensic techniques we have today. DNA analysis was still years away from common use. The pattern itself was puzzling. The methods varied. Strangulation in some cases, other means in others. But the staging remained consistent. Children held for days, bodies left in visible places, clothing clean or unchanged. It suggested someone with time, with privacy, with a space where they could keep a child for nearly a week without being discovered. Leads and letters. Over the years, various leads emerged. Some seemed promising at first, only to fade under closer examination. There was a letter sent to a psychiatrist from someone who called himself Alan. In this letter, the writer claimed to know who the killer was, claimed it was his partner, someone named Frank. Alan wrote of guilt, of fear, of wanting to come forward but being afraid. He asked for immunity. He suggested a meeting. The meeting was arranged. Alan never appeared. Contact ceased entirely. Whether Alan was real, whether his story had any truth to it, whether it was a hoax or a genuine confession, these questions were never answered. Various suspects were considered over the years, men with histories of harm against children, individuals connected to organized groups of predators. One man, Christopher Bush, drew particular attention. He came from a wealthy family, and he had been convicted of harming boys. There were circumstantial connections, sketches that bore some resemblance, items found in his home that might have been significant. But circumstantial evidence is not proof. No arrest was ever made. Another individual, Arch Sloan, was linked to a vehicle. Hair fibers found on some of the victims were similar to fibers from a car associated with him, but the fibers couldn't be matched conclusively to any specific person. The science wasn't precise enough. Not then. Unanswered questions. In the years since, the families of these children have spoken publicly about their frustrations. They've questioned whether the investigation was handled properly. They've wondered if evidence was overlooked, if promising leads weren't pursued as thoroughly as they should have been. Some researchers believe there may have been more victims than the 4 officially recognized. They point to similar cases in the region during the same time period. Other children who disappeared, other unsolved cases that share characteristics with these 4. Modern technology has allowed investigators to re-examine old evidence. DNA analysis, which didn't exist in 1977, can sometimes provide answers that were impossible to find decades ago. But so far, these re-examinations haven't produced the breakthrough everyone hoped for. The case remains open, officially unsolved. And the question that haunted Oakland County in 1976 and 1977 remains unanswered. Who was the babysitter? What drove them to do what they did? And perhaps most troubling, did they simply stop, or did they continue elsewhere in ways that were never connected? Closing reflection. There's something especially haunting about cases involving children. The innocence interrupted, the futures that never were, the families forever incomplete. Mark, Jill, Christine, and Timothy were simply being children, running errands, buying candy, visiting the store. Ordinary moments that should have been safe. The suburbs of Detroit moved forward as places do. Children still grew up there, still rode their bikes, still went to the store. But something had changed. Some innocence had been lost. Parents held their children a little tighter. The concept of stranger danger became more real, more present. And somewhere, perhaps, someone knows what happened. Someone has information they've never shared. Someone might remember something they didn't think was important at the time. The investigation continues, even now, nearly 50 years later, because some questions are too important to abandon. Some searches must continue, no matter how much time passes. Let's move on now to another place, another time, another mystery that has endured for decades. We travel now across the Atlantic to Scotland in the late 1960s, to the city of Glasgow, and to a place where people went to dance, to forget their troubles, to enjoy an evening of music and company. It was a place called the Barrowland Ballroom, and it was there that three women would spend their final hours, meeting a man whose true identity has never been discovered. Case 2. Bible John. Setting the scene. Glasgow in the late 1960s was a city of contrasts, industrial, hard-working, but also lively, especially on weekend nights when people wanted to unwind after a long week. The Barrowland Ballroom on the city's East End was one of those places where people went to escape for a few hours. The ballroom held regular dances, weekend evenings. The dance floor would fill with couples, with friends, with people looking to meet someone new. There were even special nights. Granny nights, they called them, when older folks and married people could attend without judgment, just to enjoy the music and the atmosphere. It was a place that should have been associated with joy, with celebration, with harmless fun. But between 1968 and 1969, something happened that would forever change how people thought of the Barrowland. Three women who spent their evenings there would never return home. And the man they were last seen with, the man who became known as Bible John, would never be identified. Patricia Docker. February 22nd, 1968, was a Thursday evening. Patricia Docker was 25 years old, a nurse, separated from her husband, living with her parents. She told them she was going to the Majestic Ballroom that night. A small deception, perhaps, the kind people sometimes tell to avoid questions. Instead, she went to the Barrowland. Patricia never came home that night. At first, her parents assumed she'd stayed with friends. These things happened. She was an adult, after all, entitled to her privacy. They weren't immediately concerned. But the next morning, Patricia's father was reading the newspaper. There was a description of an unidentified woman who had been found. Something about the description troubled him, details that seemed familiar. It was Patricia. She had been discovered in a lane near her home early that morning. Her handbag and some of her clothing were missing. She had been harmed in ways that suggested rage or hatred or something dark and incomprehensible. The investigation began, but crucial time had been lost. By the time police connected Patricia's death to the Barrowland Ballroom, memories had faded. People who might have seen her leave with someone couldn't be sure anymore. The trail had gone cold almost before it began. 18 months pass. Time moved on, as it does. The case of Patricia Docker remained unsolved, but life in Glasgow continued. The Barrowland kept hosting its dances. People kept going, kept dancing, kept meeting strangers. 18 months passed. Summer turned to fall. August 15th, 1969 was a Friday night. Jemima MacDonald was 32, a mother of 3. She arranged for a babysitter and went to the Barrowland for an evening out. A brief escape from the responsibilities of daily life. Neighbors later remembered hearing children talking about seeing Auntie Jemima with a man. There were reports of screams from a nearby empty building, but this was Glasgow on a weekend night. Sounds carried, people argued, things happened. No one called the police at the time. When Jemima didn't return home, her sister grew worried. She went searching. 3 days had passed. She found Jemima in a derelict tenement, an abandoned building close to where those screams had been heard. The similarities to Patricia Docker's case were immediately apparent. Similar harm, similar items missing, the same connection to the Barrowland Ballroom. But this time, investigators had fresh information. They began interviewing people who had been at the ballroom that night. They started building a timeline, and now they suspected these might not be isolated incidents. There might be someone targeting women who visited the Barrowland, someone who danced, who talked, who seemed normal, and then revealed something else entirely. The third victim and a witness. October 30th, 1969. A Thursday evening, another dance night at the Barrowland. 29-year-old Helen Puttock went with her sister Jean. It was meant to be a fun evening out. Sisters together, enjoying music. Perhaps meeting some interesting people. They did meet people. 2 men, both introducing themselves as John. They spent the evening dancing, talking. One of the men, the one who would later become known as Bible John, said he was from Castle Milk. He mentioned that he didn't drink at New Year's because he spent the time in prayer instead. He quoted passages from the Bible. He talked about religion, about morality. It might have seemed odd, but not necessarily alarming. Some people are religious. Some people like to share their beliefs. The conversation continued. After the dance ended, Jean, Helen, and Bible John shared a taxi. The man talked about adultery, spoke of it disapprovingly, with judgment in his voice. He mentioned a cousin who had played for a local football team. Small details, personal information that suggested this was a real person with a real history. Jean got out of the taxi first. She said goodbye to her sister, not knowing it would be the last time. The taxi continued with Helen and the man inside. In the early hours of the next morning, a neighbor walking his dog made a terrible discovery. Helen's body was in the back garden of a tenement not far from where she lived. Her handbag was missing, though its contents were scattered nearby, suggesting the bag itself had been taken, perhaps as a souvenir. The investigation intensifies. This time, the police had something they hadn't had before. They had a witness. Jean had sat in a taxi with this man. She had listened to him talk. She had observed him closely. She described him in detail. Mid-20s to early 30s, tall and slim, reddish or fair hair, well-dressed, presentable, and one distinctive feature, overlapping teeth in his upper jaw. A composite sketch was created and distributed across Glasgow. It showed a clean-cut, respectable-looking young man, the kind of person who could blend into a crowd at a dance hall, who could strike up a conversation without raising suspicion. The investigation became one of the largest manhunts in Scottish history. Police interviewed tens of thousands of men. They visited factories, shipyards, army barracks. They went to the Barrowland Ballroom, both uniformly and undercover, watching, listening, hoping to spot someone who matched the description or who repeated those distinctive biblical references. The media gave him the name that would stick, Bible John, because of those conversations about faith and morality and prayer. It created a chilling image, a killer who quoted Scripture, who judged others while committing terrible acts himself. The pattern. Investigators noticed details that connected all three cases. Each woman had been at the Barrowland Ballroom on the night they disappeared. Each had been harmed in similar ways. Each had their handbag taken. Each was left relatively close to their own home, as if the person who harmed them had walked them most of the way there before revealing his true nature. And there was another detail, one that investigators found particularly significant. Each of the three women had been menstruating at the time of their death. Items related to this had been removed and placed near the bodies. Some investigators theorized this might be significant, that perhaps the killer was enraged by this, that his religious beliefs or psychological state made this detail important to him. Perhaps he had expected something different from these encounters, and when he discovered this natural biological fact, something in him shifted. But these are only theories. The truth of what drove Bible John, assuming all three cases are indeed connected to the same person, remains unknown. Suspects and dead ends. Over the decades, various suspects have been proposed. Men who resembled the sketch, men with histories of violence, men whose movements placed them in Glasgow at the right times. One name that has received particular attention in more recent years is Peter Tobin, a serial killer who was active in Scotland, whose age and appearance could have matched, whose movements during the late 1960s are not entirely accounted for. Investigators looked into this possibility. They compared what they knew about Tobin to what they knew about Bible John. But despite the circumstantial connections, nothing definitive emerged. The police have never formally declared that Tobin was Bible John, and the case remains officially unsolved. Modern forensic techniques have been applied. Clothing from the victims, preserved for decades, has been tested for DNA evidence. But the results have been inconclusive, samples contaminated, degraded, or simply too small to provide a clear answer. Some researchers have even suggested that perhaps not all three murders were committed by the same person, that perhaps the similarities are coincidental, or that someone copied the pattern of an earlier crime. But most investigators still lean toward the theory of a single perpetrator, linked by those distinctive details: the Barrowland connection, the similar methods, that unusual detail about menstruation. The enduring mystery. There's something particularly frustrating about this case. The police came so close. Jean sat in a taxi with this man. She heard his voice, observed his mannerisms, noted his appearance. The composite sketch was detailed and widely distributed. Thousands of men were interviewed, and yet nothing. No identification, no arrest, no resolution. The women themselves, Patricia, Jemima, and Helen, sometimes become footnotes in the story of Bible John, overshadowed by the mystery of the killer's identity. But they were real people with real lives. Patricia was a nurse, caring for others. Jemima was a mother, raising 3 children. Helen had 2 children and worked in a factory. They went dancing. They met someone who seemed nice, or at least normal, and they never came home. In recent years, there's been increased attention paid to the victims themselves, efforts to remember them as people, not just as cases, to honor their memories, separate from the mystery that surrounds their deaths. Where the case stands. More than 50 years have passed since Helen Puttock was found in that tenement garden. Bible John, whoever he was, would be in his 80s now, if he's still alive. Perhaps he's passed away, taking his secrets with him. Perhaps he's still out there, an elderly man with memories he's never shared. The case remains open, officially unsolved, a mystery that captivated Scotland and continues to fascinate true crime researchers to this day. The Barrowland Ballroom still stands, though it's changed over the years. People still go there for concerts and events. But the building carries its history with it, a reminder of 3 women who danced there on their final nights, and of a man whose name was never discovered. Let's take a moment now, and then we'll journey to another place, to the American Southwest, to a discovery that would reveal a pattern of tragedy hidden in the desert earth. We move now from the dance halls of Scotland to the wide expanses of the American Southwest, to New Mexico, to the city of Albuquerque, and to a February morning in 2009 when a woman walking her dog noticed something unusual in the sandy soil. Case 3. The West Mesa Bone Collector. The discovery. February 2nd, 2009 started as an ordinary day. A woman was walking her dog on the West Mesa, the area on the western edge of Albuquerque where the city gradually fades into desert scrubland. It's the kind of landscape that's common in New Mexico. Sandy soil, sparse vegetation, wide views of the mountains in the distance. Her dog was exploring, the way dogs do, and then she noticed something, a bone protruding from the ground, not an animal bone, something else, something that made her pause, made her look more closely. She took a photograph and sent it to her sister, who happened to be a nurse. Her sister looked at the image and felt a chill of recognition. That was a human bone. The police were called. They arrived expecting perhaps a single set of remains, perhaps someone who had died in the desert, a tragic but singular event. What they found was far more extensive. The excavation. As investigators began to carefully examine the area near where that first bone had been spotted, they realized they were looking at multiple burial sites. Not one body, not two, many. Over the following weeks, a large-scale excavation took place. The site was near 118th Street Southwest, an area that had only recently begun to see residential development. For years it had been empty desert, accessible, isolated, a place where someone could come and go without being observed. The excavation revealed 11 sets of remains, 11 women and girls, and one more, the remains of an unborn child, still with its mother. 12 lives ended and hidden in shallow graves spread across a relatively small area, the largest crime scene in Albuquerque's history. The victims. As the identification process began, a pattern emerged. These were not random victims. They shared characteristics. They fit a profile. Most were Hispanic women and girls, ranging in age from 15 to 32. Most had been involved in sex work, often connected to drug use, living on the margins of society in ways that made them vulnerable, that made their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate, intensive searches. One victim was Michelle Valdez, 22 years old and 4 months pregnant when she disappeared. Her remains and those of her unborn child were found together, 2 lives taken, 2 futures erased. The youngest victims were particularly heartbreaking. Jamie Barella was only 15 when she vanished in 2004. She had gone to a park with a cousin, a normal teenage outing. She never came home. Her family searched, reported her missing, hoped she might have run away and would eventually return. Instead, years later, she was found in the desert. Selenia Edwards was also 15. She was the only African-American victim and the only one known to be from out of state. She had run away from Lawton, Oklahoma, somehow ending up in Albuquerque, where she too vanished into a life on the streets before disappearing entirely. The timeline. As investigators pieced together missing persons reports and tried to establish when each woman had last been seen, a time frame emerged. The disappearances had occurred between approximately 2001 and 2005, a 4 or 5 year period, during which these women and girls had gone missing one by one, with no one connecting the cases at the time. Satellite imagery of the area provided another clue. Photographs taken between 2003 and 2005 showed tire tracks and disturbed soil in the location where the bodies would later be found. This suggested the burials had occurred during that period, over time, rather than all at once. Someone had been coming back to this site repeatedly, bringing more victims, using the same remote location again and again. By around 2006, things changed. Residential development began expanding toward the West Mesa. The empty desert was being prepared for housing. Grading equipment moved earth. construction vehicles began appearing, the area became less isolated, less private, and the burials stopped. At least at that location, whether the person responsible found a different site or stopped entirely or left the area, this remains unknown. The investigation. Determining how these women and girls died proved challenging. The remains had been in the desert for years, exposed to the elements, to animals, to the natural processes of decay. Soft tissue was gone. Many types of evidence that might have been present initially had degraded or disappeared entirely. The official cause of death is listed broadly as homicidal violence, a term that acknowledges these were murders without being able to specify exact methods. There were no obvious signs of gunshot wounds or blunt force trauma severe enough to leave marks on bone. Many investigators suspect strangulation, which often leaves no skeletal evidence. But this couldn't be proven definitively for all victims. The lack of physical evidence was frustrating. This was 2009. DNA analysis existed. Forensic science had advanced considerably since the 1970s. But time and environmental exposure had destroyed most of what might have been useful. No suspect DNA was recovered that could be definitively linked to the perpetrator. Still, the investigation proceeded. A special task force was formed. A substantial reward was offered, reported as up to $100,000 for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Tips came in, were investigated, often led nowhere. Persons of interest. Police have operated on the theory that these murders were the work of one person, a serial killer they dubbed the West Mesa Bone Collector. While no official suspect has been named, attention has focused on certain individuals. Joseph Blair was one such person of interest. He was a convicted rapist who had owned a landscaping business. Witnesses reported seeing him in areas where sex workers congregated. Investigators found what they thought might be a significant clue. A plant nursery tag discovered near the burial site that matched a nursery Blair had used in his business. But matching a plant tag to a business, while interesting, is not evidence of murder. Many people might have used that same nursery. The connection was circumstantial. Investigators were unable to build a case that could result in charges. Another individual who drew attention was Lorenzo Montoya. He had lived close to the burial area. He had a history involving sex workers, and investigators found tire tracks leading from the burial site toward a street near his former home. Suggestive, but again, not proof. Montoya also presented another kind of challenge. In 2006, before the bodies were discovered, he was shot and killed. A teenage sex worker reported that he had been attempting to strangle her, and her boyfriend intervened, shooting Montoya in the struggle. His death meant he could never be questioned about the West Mesa case. And there was another complication. Under New Mexico law at the time, DNA from deceased suspects could not be automatically uploaded to national databases unless they had been formally charged with a crime before death. This limited investigators' ability to compare Montoya's DNA to evidence from the crime scene or from other unsolved cases. Some in law enforcement have indicated they believe Montoya is a strong suspect, but without definitive proof, his connection to the West Mesa murders remains officially unproven. Unresolved questions. The discovery at West Mesa raised troubling possibilities that extend beyond the 11 known victims. 8 additional women with similar backgrounds, involved in sex work, struggling with addiction, living on the streets of Albuquerque, remain missing from that same general time period. Could there be more victims? Other burial sites in the vast desert surrounding the city? The area is enormous, much of it rarely visited. If someone wanted to hide remains, there are countless places where they might remain undiscovered for years or decades, or perhaps forever. The fact that the known burial site appears to have been abandoned once development approached raises the question: did the person responsible simply move their activities elsewhere? Is there another West Mesa waiting to be found? These questions haunt the investigators who continue working on the case. They haunt the families of the missing women who were never found. And they represent a broader societal question about how much attention is paid when the victims are people living on society's margins, people struggling with addiction, people whose disappearances might not trigger the same immediate response as others. Reflection. Each of those 11 women, that 15-year-old girl, had a story. They had families, dreams, struggles. They were daughters, sisters, mothers. Michelle Valdez was going to have a baby. Jamie Barella was still a child herself, making child's decisions, not understanding the dangers she might face. The person who took their lives, who they were, what drove them, whether they felt remorse or satisfaction or nothing at all, this remains unknown. The West Mesa case stands open. The task force continues to solicit tips, to follow leads when they emerge, to hope that someday someone will come forward with the information that makes everything clear. Until then, the desert keeps its secrets. Let's move forward now to another mystery, another pattern of crimes spread across distance and time. We travel now across multiple states in the American South, along highways that stretch through Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and beyond, following a pattern that emerged slowly over many years, a pattern that might connect to a single perpetrator, or might represent something more diffuse and troubling. Case 4. The Redhead Murders. A pattern noticed. Sometimes patterns are obvious immediately, other times they emerge slowly as different pieces of information gradually come together as investigators begin to notice similarities they hadn't seen before. The Redhead Murders are a case of the latter. Between the late 1970s and the early 1990s, in several states across the American South and Appalachia, women were found dead along or near major highways. Many had red hair or strawberry blonde or auburn. Many were slight in build. Many were initially unidentified. It took time for anyone to wonder if these cases might be connected. They occurred across different jurisdictions, different states, different years. But gradually, the similarities became too noticeable to ignore. At least 6 to 11 women and girls, depending on which cases are included, fit the pattern. White women with red-tinted hair found near interstates, often partially clothed or nude, frequently strangled. Many were living transient lives, hitchhiking, sex work, estranged from families who might have reported the missing quickly. The geography of highways. The cases clustered along major interstate routes, I-40 running east-west through Tennessee and Arkansas, I-75 running north-south through Kentucky and Tennessee, I-24, I-59, I-81, highways that connect cities, that long-haul truck drivers use, that people travel when they're moving from one place to another without a fixed destination. The time frame spans from around October 1978 through to approximately 1992, though the most concentrated cluster of cases occurred in the mid-1980s. This lengthy time frame made patterns harder to detect. Investigators working one case in 1982 might not know about a similar case that had occurred in 1979 in a different state. The locations where bodies were found were typically isolated spots off highway exits or rest areas, places where someone could pull over briefly, leave something, and drive away without being observed. The South has no shortage of such locations. Rural roads, wooded areas, places where months might pass before anyone ventured close enough to notice something amiss. The identified victims. For years, some of these victims remained Jane Does, unidentified women whose names and histories were mysteries. Gradually, through fingerprint analysis and more recently, through genetic genealogy, some have been identified. Lisa Nichols was 28, from West Virginia. She had strawberry blonde hair. In September 1984, she was found near I-40 in West Memphis, Arkansas. She had been strangled. She was partially clothed. It took months before investigators could put a name to her remains. Tina Marie McKinney Farmer was 21 and pregnant when she disappeared. She was last seen with a truck driver heading toward Kentucky. In 1985, her body was found near I-75 in Campbell County, Tennessee. She had been strangled, wrapped in a blanket, and left near the highway. For many years, she remained unidentified, known only as one more Jane Doe. It wasn't until 2018 that advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to finally determine who she was. Others include Lori Ann Pennell, found in Mississippi; Espy Regina Black Pilgrim in Kentucky; Elizabeth Lamotte in Tennessee, all in 1985, all with red-tinted hair, all found near highways after being strangled. The fact that many remained unidentified for so long meant that investigators couldn't contact their families, couldn't trace their last movements, couldn't build timelines of where they had been and who they might have encountered. The trail, already cold, became even colder. A truck driver suspect. In 1985, something happened that would eventually provide a partial answer to at least one of these mysteries, though it took decades for the connection to be proven. A red-haired woman named Linda Shaka was abducted in Tennessee by a truck driver named Jerry Leon Johns. He bound her, strangled her, and then dumped her near an interstate, believing she was dead. But Linda survived, badly injured, traumatized, but alive. She was able to testify about what had happened to her. Jerry Leon Johns was arrested, tried, and convicted in 1987. For years, this seemed like an isolated case. Johns was in prison. Linda had survived, and the matter appeared closed. But in 2019, advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to compare genetic material from Johns to evidence collected from old crime scenes, and they found a match. Jerry Leon Johns was definitively linked to the murder of Tina Marie Farmer, the young pregnant woman whose body had been found in Tennessee in 1985. This confirmed what investigators had suspected. Johns was responsible for at least one of the redhead murders. But that confirmation also raised new questions. Was he responsible for the others? His work as a truck driver would have given him the mobility, the opportunity. He had demonstrated the pattern, targeting red-haired women, strangulation, highway disposal. But DNA evidence linking him to the other cases has not been found. Investigators consider him a prime suspect, a strong focus of interest. But without definitive proof, the question remains open. One murder solved, several others still waiting for answers. The Bible Belt Strangler Theory. In 2018, something unusual happened. A high school sociology class in Tennessee took an interest in these cases. Students began working with open-source case files, studying the patterns, creating timelines, mapping locations. They developed a profile. They called their theoretical perpetrator the Bible Belt Strangler, suggesting a single truck-driving serial killer who targeted vulnerable red-haired women along interstate routes in the mid-1980s. Their work was impressive for high school students. They helped narrow the list of likely connected victims to about 6 cases, many of which overlapped with Jerry Leon Johns's known movements and timeline. Their research brought renewed attention to these cold cases. But law enforcement, while appreciating the students' efforts, remains cautious. The larger umbrella of redhead murders might involve multiple perpetrators. The cases span more than a decade, across many states, without definitive physical evidence linking them all together, matching DNA, matching fingerprints, ballistics that prove the same weapon was used. Investigators cannot say with certainty that one person was responsible for all of them. Why the mystery persists. Several factors have made these cases particularly difficult to solve. Many victims went unidentified for years, even decades. Without knowing who they were, investigators couldn't trace their movements, couldn't interview people who had seen them, couldn't establish timelines of their final days. The victims' lifestyles, hitchhiking, transient living, survival sex work, meant their movements were often untracked. They might have been in several different states in the span of a week. They might have accepted rides from numerous different people. They might have had interactions that no one else witnessed. The jurisdictional splits across multiple states created challenges. Different police departments, different procedures, different levels of resources, a detective in Tennessee might not know about a similar case in Arkansas. Information sharing in the 1980s was nothing like it is today. And then there's the possibility that has troubled investigators from the beginning. What if these cases aren't all connected? What if some are the work of one person and others are the work of different individuals? What if the similarities are partially coincidental or partially the result of one killer copying another? These are questions without clear answers. What we know, what we don't. We know that Jerry Leon Johns killed at least one woman who fits the pattern. Tina Marie Farmer, pregnant, red-haired, found near a highway in Tennessee. His DNA proves his guilt in that case. We know that he attempted to kill Linda Shaka in a nearly identical manner, and only luck and her own resilience saved her life. We can reasonably suspect that Johns might be responsible for other cases that match his pattern, his timeline, his geographic range, but suspicion is not proof. The other cases, the women who remain unidentified, the murders that don't conclusively link to Johns or any other specific suspect, these remain open, officially unsolved. Questions waiting for answers that may never come. Remembering the victims. It's easy, in cases like these, to focus on the pattern, the mystery, the question of whether one killer or many killers were responsible. The unknown becomes the focal point. But there were real people at the center of these cases. Lisa Nichols, who had a family in West Virginia who missed her. Tina Marie Farmer, who was going to have a baby, who was only 21. The women whose names we still don't know, who are still listed as Jane Does, who were someone's daughter, possibly someone's sister, someone who mattered to someone somewhere. They were living difficult lives, making hard choices, surviving as best they could. They accepted rides from someone they hoped would be safe, and that trust cost them everything. The highways of the South still stretch long and empty through rural areas. Truck drivers still travel those routes day and night, moving goods from one place to another. Most are simply doing their jobs, living honest lives. But somewhere in the 1980s and early 1990s, someone used those highways for darker purposes. And whether that someone was Jerry Leon Johns acting alone, or multiple different individuals, or Johns plus others we haven't identified, this remains one of the mysteries these cases leave us with. Let's pause for a moment, and then we'll travel back in time to an earlier era, to a case that predates modern forensics entirely, to New Orleans in the early 20th century. We journey now back in time to an era before DNA analysis, before computerized databases, before many of the tools that modern investigators take for granted. We travel to New Orleans, to the years 1918 and 19, to a time when a different kind of terror gripped the city, when families would lock their doors at night and wonder if the axeman might visit them next. Case 5. The Axeman of New Orleans. New Orleans in 1918. Picture New Orleans at the end of the First World War, a port city, humid and lively, full of jazz music and cultural diversity, neighborhoods of immigrants Italian families in particular, who had come to America seeking better lives, who opened small businesses, who worked hard to establish themselves in their new home. Many of these Italian immigrants ran grocery stores, small operations, often with the family living in apartments above or behind the shop. They sold basic goods to their neighbors, operated on thin margins, worked long hours. These were not wealthy people, but they were making their way. In May of 1918, something terrible began happening to these families. The first attack. May 22nd, 1918. Joseph Maggio ran a small grocery with his wife, Catherine. They lived in an apartment near their shop, close to the French Quarter. They went to bed that night like any other night. No reason to expect anything unusual. Joseph's brother, Andrew, lived next door. In the early morning hours, he heard something, groans, sounds of distress coming from his brother's apartment. But Andrew had been drinking that evening. His mind was foggy, his reaction slow. He wasn't sure if he had really heard something or if he was imagining things. As dawn broke, Andrew went to check on his brother. What he found was a scene of horror. Joseph and Catherine had both been attacked while they slept. An axe, their own axe, taken from their kitchen, had been used to fracture their skulls. Their throats had been cut with a razor. Catherine had already passed. Joseph was still barely alive, but he couldn't speak, couldn't explain what had happened. He died soon after. The police arrived and began investigating. They noticed that the door had been tampered with, a panel chiseled out, creating just enough space for someone to reach through and unlock the door from inside. No forced entry, no noise that would wake the neighbors. A quiet, careful method. But who would do such a thing, and why? Nothing had been stolen. The cash register in the shop hadn't been touched. This wasn't robbery. This was something else. A pattern emerges. Over the following months, more attacks occurred. Each one followed a similar pattern, though the victims didn't always die. On June 28th, a man named Louis Bassumer and his partner were attacked in their beds. Both were struck on the head. The woman, Anna Lowe, was severely injured, her face damaged terribly. In her pain and confusion, she accused Bassumer of attacking her. He was arrested, spent 9 months in jail before being acquitted. The real attacker was never found. In August, Edward Schneider came home to find his pregnant wife had been attacked. She was alive, badly injured, but she survived. Their baby survived too, born despite the trauma the mother had endured. Also in August, Joseph DeVee, a grocery owner, was killed while sleeping. The weapon appeared to be a cleaver-like tool. Again, the method was similar, a quiet entry, an attack on someone sleeping, no theft. The investigation struggled. Different jurisdictions, limited forensic tools, false accusations, and wrongful arrests. The police were trying, but they seemed to always be one step behind. March 1919, the letter. Then, in March of 1919, something unusual happened. The New Orleans Times-Picayune newspaper received a letter. It was postmarked from hell, a dramatic touch, whether real or added by the sender as a flourish. The letter was signed held by you, and it was unlike anything the police had received before. The writer claimed to be something supernatural, a demon, an entity beyond human understanding. They spoke of being connected to the angel of death. They boasted of being impossible to catch. And then the letter made a specific claim. On March 19th at 12:15 in the morning, the writer would visit New Orleans again. But, and here was the strange part, any home where jazz music was playing would be spared. If you wanted to be safe, play jazz. The axeman, the letter claimed, loved jazz music. The city reacted with a mixture of fear and dark humor. March 19th arrived. People gathered in the homes, jazz bands played, music drifted through the streets of New Orleans from midnight onward, and that night no one was attacked. Whether the letter was genuine, whether it was actually from the person committing these crimes, or whether it was a hoax, this remains debated. But the fact remains that after that night, months passed without incident. The attacks seemed to have stopped. October. The final known attack. But the calm didn't last forever. On October 27th, 1919, one more attack occurred. Mike Pepitone, another grocer, was sleeping in his bedroom. His wife was in another room. In the night, she heard sounds, a struggle, perhaps, or cries of distress. She rushed to the bedroom and saw two shadowy figures fleeing the scene. Mike had been attacked with an axe. Multiple blows to the head. He did not survive. And then, nothing. No more attacks. The axemen, whoever they were, disappeared as mysteriously as they had appeared. The case went cold. The investigation's challenges. Looking back, we can see how limited the investigators were by the technology and methods of their time. This was 1918, 1919. There was no way to analyze DNA. Fingerprint analysis was still in its infancy. There were no security cameras, no cell phone records, no digital footprints to follow. The police did what they could. They interviewed suspects, followed leads, made arrests. But most of these arrests were based on weak evidence or prejudice. At one point, two men, Frank and Orlando Jordano, who ran a competing grocery, were accused by one of the survivors, Rosie Cortimiglia, who had lost her young daughter in an attack, pointed to the Jordanos and said they were responsible. They were convicted. Frank was sentenced to hang, Orlando to life in prison. But later, Rosie recanted. She admitted she had lied, perhaps out of jealousy or competition or some personal grudge. The Jordanos were freed in 1920, their lives upended by false accusations. Theories and speculation. Over the years, various theories have been proposed about who the axemen might have been and what motivated them. Some suggested mafia connections. The victims were Italian, and there was anti-Italian sentiment in New Orleans at the time, connected to past incidents and stereotypes. But the attacks didn't follow typical patterns of organized crime. No clear motive, no demands for money, no messages left behind, except for that one strange letter. Some wondered if it might be multiple attackers, copycat crimes, where someone read about the first attack and decided to do something similar. The weapons varied slightly. The exact methods had minor differences. Could these have been different people, all using the general pattern but acting independently? Others speculated about a single disturbed individual, perhaps someone who worked as a laborer, who moved from place to place, who had some personal grudge against Italian grocers or some psychological compulsion that drove them to these specific targets. The supernatural explanation offered in the letter, the demon, the connection to the angel of death. This was almost certainly either a hoax or the delusions of someone deeply troubled, but it added to the atmosphere of fear and mystery. What connected the cases? Despite the variations and uncertainties, certain elements did link these attacks together. The method of entry was consistent, chiseling out a door panel, creating quiet access. The weapon was almost always the victim's own axe or similar tool taken from the home. The timing was at night, targeting people while they slept. The victims were predominantly Italian grocers and their families. These consistencies suggested to investigators that they were dealing with one person, or possibly a small group working together. The pattern was too specific, too repeated, to be entirely coincidental. But without physical evidence, without witnesses who got a clear look at the attacker, without confessions or concrete proof, the case remained unsolved. The attacks stop. After Mike Pepitone's death in October 1919, the attacks ceased. There were no more incidents that matched the pattern. The axeman simply stopped. Why? Perhaps the person responsible left New Orleans. Perhaps they were arrested for some other crime and imprisoned without authorities realizing they had been the axeman. Perhaps they died in the influenza pandemic that was raging at the time, or in an accident, or by violence, or perhaps they simply decided to stop. Serial offenders sometimes do cease their activities for reasons that are never fully understood. They might feel they've pushed their luck far enough. They might move on to other things. They might suppress whatever drove them to act in the first place. Whatever the reason, New Orleans gradually returned to normal. The intense fear faded. Life went on. The case remained in the history books as one of America's earliest documented serial crime sprees. But active investigation eventually ceased. A century later. More than 100 years have passed since those terrifying months in 1918 and 1918. Everyone directly involved, the victims, the investigators, the axeman themselves, have long since passed away. Modern researchers have looked back at the case with contemporary forensic knowledge and criminal profiling techniques. They've analyzed the patterns, compared them to known serial offenders, developed theories about who the axeman might have been. But theories are all they remain. There's no evidence to test with modern DNA analysis. The crime scenes are long gone. The physical evidence, if it was even properly collected at the time, has been lost to history. The case remains officially unsolved. The identity of the axeman of New Orleans is still unknown. Reflection on an earlier era. There's something particularly haunting about these early unsolved cases. Crimes from an era before modern forensics, before the tools and techniques that we now take for granted. The investigators were doing their best with what they had, but they were working in the dark in ways we can hardly imagine now. The victims and their families deserved justice. They deserved answers. But the limitations of the time, the challenges of the investigation, and perhaps the cleverness or luck of the perpetrator meant that justice never came. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Mike Pepitone, the others who lost their lives or were injured, they were simply living their lives, working hard, trying to provide for their families. They locked their doors at night, thinking themselves safe, and someone found a way in anyway. The jazz music playing through New Orleans on that March night in 1919. People gathering together, using music as a talisman against fear. It's a vivid image. A city refusing to be completely paralyzed by terror. Finding a way to assert life and joy, even in the face of violence. And perhaps that's a fitting place to leave this story. Music in the darkness. People continuing on despite their fear. Life persisting, even when mysteries remain unsolved. And so we've journeyed through 5 mysteries, 5 cases that remain unsolved, questions that linger decades or even a century after the events occurred. From the suburbs of Detroit to the dance halls of Glasgow, from the deserts of New Mexico to the highways of the American South, from the streets of early 20th century New Orleans, these stories remind us that some questions don't have easy answers. Some mysteries persist despite the best efforts of investigators, despite advances in technology, despite the passage of time. The families of those who were lost continue to hope for answers. Investigators continue to work on these cases when new leads emerge. And perhaps, someday, a breakthrough will come. A DNA match, a deathbed confession, a piece of evidence that finally makes everything clear. Until then, these cases remain open. The questions remain unanswered. And we remember those who were lost, not just as victims, not just as cases, but as people who lived, who mattered to others, whose stories deserve to be told. Thank you for listening tonight. As you drift off to sleep, let these stories fade into the background. Let your mind quiet. Let yourself rest. These mysteries have waited decades for answers. They can wait a little longer while you sleep peacefully. Good night.